a warm welcome to you all. And so my pleasure to hand over for our final session to Earl to talk to us tonight about Evelyn Underhill.
Okay, thanks, Dan, and thanks all of you. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Well, we're very much in the 20th century with Underhill, and there are a number of changes from the previous people that we talked about. The most obvious one being that she's an Anglican laywoman. The others were medieval Catholics. Medieval Catholic is a bit anachronistic because before the Reformation, the whole church was the Catholic Church, and it wasn't just the Roman Catholic Church. The labels that we're familiar with come later, but certainly Eckhart and Mechthild of Magdeburg were very much medieval Catholics. Elizabeth of the Trinity was a French Roman Catholic of the post-Reformation period. And all three of them are religious in the technical sense of that word, as used in the Catholic Church, meaning dedicated life or consecrated life. Underhill was a laywoman and in many ways, to all appearances, a very kind of straightforward, fairly middle class sort of laywoman, married to a successful barrister, born and brought up in London, always considered herself a Londoner. And that's only on the surface, that's the appearance, because actually I think she's one of the most remarkable women of the 20th century. And she's certainly one of the most remarkable Anglican theologians that there's ever been. It's important to say that at the start because, you know, if you ask people outside limited circles about Evelyn Underhill, usually they haven't heard of her, surprisingly. I mean, I give a module in the Chichester MA theology degree, and I do a section in Christian leadership, and I use her as one of the examples. And she's almost never been heard of by most of the people I've taught. And she's also not terribly easy to, books about her are not terribly easy to find. She's relatively easy to find herself because it's now all in Kindle. So you can get most of Evelyn Underhill's works quite easily downloaded onto Kindle. I'll come back to the works in a moment. So I wouldn't say that she's exactly a household name, and in many ways she should be more. And that was brought home to me recently by the late Dr. Anne Loades, who had been a professor of theology at Durham University and a very remarkable woman theologian in her own right in the Church of England, breaking all sorts of new ground when she was appointed. She died quite recently. In fact, she contributed to our Chichester Diocese Lent course, and I had a correspondence with her about her contribution, and about 3 days later, the bishop wrote to me to say that she had died very suddenly. So I was never able to communicate with her again. But during our email correspondence, I mentioned to her that I had read her book on Evelyn Underhill, which she published, I think, in the 90s. And she said to me that it was a remarkable thing that in that series, which was great Christian thinkers, which included Bonaventure and Aquinas and all the usual people, that the one book that they weren't republishing was her one on Evelyn Underhill. And she was saying that she found that unfortunate and strange, and I do too, because I think Evelyn Underhill is somebody who deserves to have a great deal more attention given to her. But why? Well, first of all, as I say, let's run through her life, which is at many levels fairly straightforward. Born and brought up, born 1875, an only child, fairly comfortable middle-class family, educated at home, as girls were in those days, but obviously superbly educated at home because she became fluent in the classical languages, and she also became fluent in at least 3 modern languages. So highly gifted young woman. And, you know, she's famous for her great book, Mysticism, from 1911. Again, I'll come back to that. But the idea of Evelyn Underhill as a kind of wilting violet, you know, in a closeted kind of home, really isn't true, because she loved yachting. For example, she went out on yachts frequently with her parents and with her husband, who was a complete fanatic for yachting. So we also have to think of her not just at home studying medieval mystics and, you know, learning foreign languages, but out on the open sea in a yacht, combining all sorts of areas of life, not just rarefied academia or intellectual life. Where she became famous was with probably the most important book published on mysticism in the 20th century in 1911. So she wasn't that old when she published it. This book, Mysticism, called Mysticism, yeah. And this book has never been out of print since 1911. She issued a couple of reissues of it in the 20s, but changed hardly anything, and it just wrote a new preface. The actual book has never been out of print, which is really quite an achievement. And that was the book that made her name and meant that she has entered the Hall of Anglican Fame and of far beyond the Anglican Church of theological fame. And what's really interesting about her is that she summarizes in her own self the study of mysticism in the 20th century. Now, let me clarify that a little bit. The word mysticism, she begins Mysticism, the book, by saying, it can cover anything from esoteric stuff to fantasy to magic. It's the most debased word there is. Now, if that was true in 1911, that's even more true in 2023, because if you go into any of the mainstream bookshops in London, say, and look for the mysticism section, it'll be in there with all sorts of stuff like the benefits of foot massage and Reiki and tarot card readings and all sorts of stuff. And it has given the word a kind of bad name. I mean, when I was teaching this in Chichester quite recently, teaching Underhill, somebody said to me, but isn't she associated with the occult? Because, of course, if you Google her, it'll come up as the occult. And just to clarify that, she was involved before and after the First World War with various esoteric circles in London, which included some really remarkable and eminent people, including W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, the Order of the Golden Dawn, and all these people. It was also full of crackpots like Aleister Crowley, who was a very shady character. And that was an esoteric group which was reading mysticism in this general esoteric sort of way. And Evelyn Underhill emerged from that group, aware of the fact that there had to be a serious academic study of mysticism. It wasn't enough to leave it floating in a sort of nebulous sphere of esotericism and spiritual subjectivity. It had to be rescued. The reason being that it is, of course, one of the great Christian words. Now, the word mysticism itself is an 18th century invention. The early church knew nothing of a word called mysticism. In the early church, the mystical, mysticus in Latin or mystikos in Greek, referred to the hidden meaning of scripture. That's the original meaning of it. So scripture was understood to have an upfront obvious meaning, say the temple at Jerusalem, if we read about that in the Old Testament, but it was also understood to have a mystical, hidden, secret meaning, which the job of the exegete and the preacher was to uncover. So mysticism referred to an objective, hidden content in Holy Scripture. But by the time she was writing, it had detached itself from its original Christian base and gone out into the world of spirituality in general. Therefore, it lost its Christian ballast, which was keeping it tied down to a degree, but also keeping it sensible as well. And it became a general term, a generic term for spiritual experience, often of a very weird or esoteric kind. So she wrote mysticism to try to go to the great texts, the great sources, and represent them in a way which would recover an authentic Christian vision of mysticism. And she was well equipped to do that because in addition to Greek and Latin, she had French and Italian and Spanish. She didn't, as far as I know, master German or Flemish, although she was very interested in those traditions. But she had the help of a very close collaborator and close friend, Lucy Menzies. Lucy Menzies was one of her closest friends, who was a German scholar. And she was able to supply what was lacking in the northern languages for Evelyn Underhill. So Underhill wrote this book, and the book is the one that really made her name. And this got rave reviews at the time. And it got rave reviews from all sorts of people. I mean, Abbot Cuthbert Butler, who was the Roman Catholic abbot of Downside Abbey and wrote one of the greatest books in the 20th century, also on mysticism, wrote to her to say, I'm profoundly impressed by your book. And she was an Anglican, she wasn't a Roman Catholic. And also, it was reviewed in The Spectator, it was reviewed in The Times, and they all said, this is writing on mysticism of a different quality from the kind of gobbledygook that most people had been writing around 1911. And above all, the person who read the book and whose attention she caught was another great Roman Catholic, a layman called Baron Friedrich von Hugel, who was an Austrian living in London, a layman and an Austrian nobleman. And von Hugel was also one of the greatest scholars of the 20th century, but he was a layman, not a priest. Now, that was very important in the 1911 Roman Catholic Church, because 1911 and the period all around then was not an easy time to be a Roman Catholic, because what you had was a campaign orchestrated from Rome against what was called modernism. And modernism was the attempt to interpret scripture with modern categories of thought. And it raised terror in Rome, and they issued an anti-modernist oath, and they sacked all sorts of professors. But von Hugel, because he was a layman, was safe because he wasn't working for a Catholic institution. And he read Underhill's book and connected with her. And there began one of those things that's very common in the history of mysticism, this wonderful spiritual friendship between a man and a woman. The much older man, Friedrich von Hugel, a Roman Catholic layman, and the considerably younger woman, Evelyn Underhill, an Anglican laywoman. And at this point in her life, as a result of a religious experience one day when she was in a church, Underhill was thinking of becoming a Roman Catholic. But she considered herself a modernist. In other words, she wanted to use modern methods of interpretation for reading scripture and so on. And when she looked at the Roman Catholic Church, she was horrified by at that point, the sacking of professors. Some of the most eminent Catholic scholars in the first 20 years of the 20th century were sacked, and their reputations destroyed as well. People were denounced, delated, as it was called, to the Vatican if they taught a modernist opinion. So Underhill looked at all this, and she went to see von Hugel, who was a Catholic layman. And you might have expected that he would have said to her, oh, listen, don't worry, just join the Roman Catholic Church. That's what you're really feeling you want to do. On the contrary, he didn't. He took a long, hard look at her. He realized that he was dealing with one of the most gifted people he'd ever met, spiritually as well as intellectually. And he said to her, take your time. Don't rush into the Roman Catholic Church. And what he told her actually was, there is a danger that in the Roman Catholic Church of 1911, now this is 1911, we're not talking about 2023, it's a long time ago, but in that culture, she would not be able to breathe spiritually. He said to her, you'll feel squeezed out by this anti-modernist thrust. And the other problem was that her husband, whom she was marrying at that time, who was a good old-fashioned, solid, middle-of-the-road Anglican, not hugely devout, but committed to his church, was absolutely horrified at the idea of her becoming a Roman Catholic, because in England at that point, the Roman Catholic Church seemed to be a sect full of weird stuff and Latin and all sorts of things that people couldn't relate to. So von Hugel also advised her with tremendous spiritual tact, don't do something that will destroy your husband's peace. I mean, he did say to her finally, if you really, really feel in your prayer and in your heart that God is telling you to go to the Roman Catholic Church, then of course go to the Roman Catholic Church. But don't do it without that kind of final certainty, because you will mess up your entire home life. And you may also find you're in an institution where you can't breathe. So that was very unusual advice from someone like von Hugel. And she couldn't have got that advice at that stage from a Roman Catholic priest, because he'd have been in big trouble if he'd given that kind of advice to anybody. Von Hugel was a layman, and therefore he was free of the constraints of the control of the system. And she went to see von Hugel, and he was her spiritual father until 1925, when he died. And there's a fabulous correspondence. I mean, he was a great correspondent. All these people were, before the internet came and murdered the art of letter writing, which is the case nowadays. I mean, all these people, they wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, Underhill and von Hugel. They wrote to each other. And what's really interesting is that von Hugel guided her from a very generic idea of mysticism, which had very little to do with Christ, to a much, much more Christian-based mystical vision, but in the Church of England, not in the Roman Catholic Church. And she was lucky and blessed, I suppose, to have met somebody who was so sensitive to her inner reality that he didn't try to impose his own on her. He didn't try to force her into a different mode. Now, Anne Lodes, whom I mentioned at the start, rest in peace, she gave a lecture. I gave a lecture and she gave a lecture a number of years ago in Hampstead, where Evelyn Underhill is buried, on Evelyn Underhill. And in her lecture, she said all that I've just said about von Hugel, but then she also said, though there were other areas where his influence was less encouraging. And unfortunately, she nipped off to get the bus at the end of the lecture. And I had thought when we started the correspondence a few weeks ago about our Lent course, I might ask her that question. What did you mean? And I'm afraid she's gone to join von Hugel and Evelyn Underhill, and I can't ask her. So I don't know what that means, but I'm presuming somewhere along the line in all these spiritual relationships, there comes a point where the one being directed feels that no matter how open the spiritual director is, they need to in some way break free of them because they need to grow their own wings. And I suspect that that was in the undercurrent of the relationship with von Hugel, but he died in 1925. And she always spoke positively about him afterwards. So there was never any suggestion of any disagreement. And certainly at the point when he met her, he steered her in a much more grounded direction. How did he do that? Well, when she was writing to him, going to see him in London, she was saying to him that she found it very difficult to imagine the incomprehensible, invisible, unknowable mystery of God coming through a carpenter from Nazareth, in effect. And she found the historical bits of the New Testament the most difficult to deal with. It's a very common phenomenon. We meet this all the time. Actually, I meet this regularly in Brighton and Hove. People who want God to be more spiritual than Bethlehem and Golgotha, because God is God and he shouldn't be getting involved with things like childbirth and crucifixion and stuff like that. And von Hugel advised her, at the beginning, accept as much of the historical faith as you can and gently feel your way into it. And he directed her to Philippians chapter 2, which says about Christ, though he was in the form of God, he did not cling to his equality with God, but emptied himself and came down. And he asked her to consider this incarnate descent of God out of the realm of mystery into the real world, the world of space and time, and to try to keep that before her. And he told her something very, very concrete. He told her to visit the poor. He said, it's not enough to sit in your room and read Eckhart and Ruysbrook and Hildegard of Bingen and all these people. You have to go out to the East End, to the slums, and actually work with real poor, suffering people. And she did that twice a week, and she did that kind of work on and off for the rest of her life. And he said, that will keep you in touch, not with mystical stratospheres, but with the real life into which Christ descended in his incarnation, its incarnate life. And the second thing he told her was, as a Roman Catholic, and he was a brilliant intellectual, and with all the foreign languages and classical languages and everything, even as an intellectual, he said, once a day, he said, 1 decade of the Rosary. Now, the Rosary is a Roman Catholic devotion, 1 Our Father and 10 Hail Marys, and glory be to the Father. Very simple, gospel-based prayer in which you meditate as you say the Hail Marys on the events of Christ's life, the mysteries, his scourging at the pillar, his crucifixion, his birth, the visitation, all the mysteries of Christ's life. And he said to her, the reason I'm telling you I do that is that that keeps my prayer connected to the prayer of ordinary people, to the simple piety of ordinary people. And it stops me imagining that I'm going off on a spiritual space rocket into some rarefied atmosphere called mysticism. So he gave her these practical pieces of advice about how to root herself more effectively in the real world. And she therefore moved from a position in mysticism in 1911, where Christ is mentioned, but not massively mentioned, and where it's pretty much talk about God. It's what she calls theocentric, to a much more Christocentric approach. And the later books that she published a very wonderful little book called The Mystic Way, They're all available on Kindle, so they're easily accessible. The Mystic Way and Practical Mysticism. 2 little books. And the second title there tells you something very concrete. It's becoming practical. It's not just about visions of the other life and so on, or the other world. It's about practicing mysticism. And it's a very interesting thing to look at that book, Practical Mysticism, because she talks about things that are now taken for granted, but that weren't taken for granted in 1920. What we would now call mindfulness, attention to the present moment, simple forms of meditation. I think she uses the example in that of focusing on a candle, the light of a candle, so that your faculties, your memory, your understanding, your will all come together in focus on the one point on the candle. And what in Buddhism is called one-pointedness, and which is there in all the Christian traditions too. And she taught people ways to ground their mystical prayer and vision in quite practical spiritual practices, which is a really important thing to do, because there's no point having immortal longings if the immortal longings don't actually find words and gestures which root them in our everyday life. And while that's kind of pretty much taken for granted by anybody who writes in spirituality nowadays, that wasn't the case in 1920, so she was a groundbreaker there as well. Now, another area where she was a very remarkable groundbreaker was that with her scholarship and her knowledge of the languages, she translated and did editions of the great mystical texts. Why do we know about Julian of Norwich? And there have been 4 English translations of Julian of Norwich in the last couple of years. Why do we know about her? Because Evelyn Underhill rescued her from obscurity. Hardly anybody had heard of Julian of Norwich before Evelyn Underhill got her hands on the manuscript. The original manuscript of Julian of Norwich was transmitted through Benedictine nuns, exiled nuns, who had gone to Flanders after the English Reformation. And they had the work of Julian of Norwich, 2 manuscripts, I think, in their convent. One of them is now in the British Museum. And Evelyn Underhill was the one who turned that for the first time into contemporary English, semi-contemporary English. She tried to keep the flavour of the old Middle English. She's very rough, raw, and earthy kind of language because she liked that. But she's the one through whom we know about Julian of Norwich. And I mean, you can't take a step forward now in spirituality. Anything, courses, they all have Julian of Norwich. I mean, when I was in Cambridge teaching a couple of years back, on the great theologians, which had traditionally been, Thomas Aquinas, Karl Barth, the kind of great books of theology, 4 years ago, they added Julian of Norwich. But before Evelyn Underhill popularized Julian of Norwich, nobody was reading Julian of Norwich. Maybe one scholar somewhere. And the second one in this English tradition, for which she's particularly famous, is the great anonymous English work called The Cloud of Unknowing. Cloud of Unknowing. The Cloud of Unknowing is a 14th century English mystical text, very famous, very wonderful one as well, probably by an anonymous person, probably a Carthusian monk somewhere around Lancashire. We're not quite sure. It looks like Lancashire medieval dialect, apparently. And again, she brought that out of obscurity and produced a relatively modern English version of it, which enabled people to read it for the first time. So 2 of the really greats of English mysticism brought into the contemporary world by Underhill. And the third one is the famous Augustinian canon, contemporary with The Cloud of Unknowing, author called Walter Hilton, with the Ladder of Ascent. Those 3 texts, Evelyn Underhill established that there is an English mystical tradition, a medieval English mystical tradition, which is one of the great gems of medieval Christian literature. Now, having just said all that, we have to deconstruct that a little bit for a moment, because as soon as that was done, it became a sectarian problem. What you had was Anglicans saying, these people are Anglicans before the Reformation, and the Anglican tradition is in continuity. And the Roman Catholics in England saying, who are also doing these editions, saying, no, these people are Roman Catholics, pure and simple. and they wouldn't recognize anything in the Anglican Church after the Reformation. So modern scholars are very skeptical about the idea of a special group of English mystics because it created so many sectarian problems. The truth of the matter, as far as I can see it, is that in one way, they are pre-Reformation Anglicans because they're members of the Church of England, but they're also in the Roman medieval system, which was changed at the Reformation. So there's continuity and discontinuity in it. And really what we need to do is get over the idea that there is one absolutely true version and one absolutely false version, which is what people labored under for 400 years. And that in fact, Christianity is a much, much more interesting mosaic. And you locate those medieval figures in the bigger mosaic. But the fact that we can locate them at all is certainly due to Underhill's scholarship. And the person she loved most in the mystical tradition was a Flemish mystic called Jan van Ruysbroek, John Ruysbroek. I mentioned him briefly last week because you may recall, if you were here last week, that Elizabeth of the Trinity quotes John Ruysbroek a lot, that French nun from the early 20th century, and she heard about him from a Dominican who gave retreats in French in the convent. But Evelyn Underhill simultaneously was reading Ruysbroek and researching his sources, and she read him in the Flemish with the help of Lucy Menzies because she didn't master Flemish or German, as far as I'm aware. And she's the one who put Ruysbroek on the map of mystical theology. And actually, Ruysbroek is certainly one of the top 5 Christian mystics of all time. Very, very remarkable 14th century mystic. And she published a beautiful little book on Ruysbroek, groundbreaking book. It was the first time anybody had written anything on him in English, which is why it's a bit sad and a bit surprising, actually, that when you go to the modern histories of mysticism, one of which I'm plowing my way through at the moment, that you won't find her in the footnotes. And I don't know what it is about Evelyn Underhill. There seems to be this tendency to airbrush her out. They mentioned everybody else who was working on Ruysbroek. Evelyn Underhill's Ruysbroek reached clergy and laity in a way that nobody else's work did. And she's the person, again, who put that in the language of the history of spirituality. There were other people she was less interested in. She wasn't hugely interested in Teresa of Avila. I mean, she does refer to her, you can't avoid her. Didn't seem to click with Teresa of Avila. And John of the Cross, she wrote very beautiful things about John of the Cross, but it doesn't seem to have fired her or inspired her in the way that Ruysbroek did. And finally, before we come to look at the book Mysticism itself, she had a particular love for St. Francis, the Franciscan tradition. Now, there's nothing uncommon about that because around the early 20th century, a number of biographies of St. Francis were published, which particularly emphasized what we would now call his ecological dimension. The very famous love for the animals, for the birds, for the insects, for nature, which is there in Francis for sure. And in the Franciscan tradition, she identified this ongoing relationship with nature. And she was a great lover of nature herself. She loved not only yachts and the sea, she loved forests, she loved countryside. She and her husband, when they could, went on holiday to Norway before the war, Second War. And she loved the atmosphere of the Norwegian fjords and the stillness and so on. So Evelyn Underhill also was very touched by this Franciscan spirit. And that's maybe part of the earthing of her mysticism as well, because Franciscan mysticism is a very earthy one. Yeah, Dominican mysticism is very abstract. It's the unknown God, the unspeakable God, the ineffable God. Franciscan mysticism is much more about the feelings, the affections, the heart, love for the child Jesus, love for the crucified Christ, the wounds of Christ. It's a very kind of concrete tradition. And that's one in which she felt very at home, while being able to handle the other tradition as well. So if we go to this book, Mysticism, if you're ever going to read anything on mysticism, or if you have done already, this is the one still to read. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect. And it doesn't mean parts of it aren't dated. There's been a lot of scholarship done since that book was published, but none of them have surpassed it. And this is this remarkable thing. I mean, this is this Anglican laywoman who never held a university position. I mean, women didn't much. It was beginning to change in the 20s and 30s, but it wasn't a common thing. She was the first woman ever to be invited to give a lecture in Oxford University in the 20s. Quite remarkable when you think of the first person ever to be invited to lecture in Oxford College. And she was given an honorary Doctor of Divinity in her last year of life, which she was too ill to go and receive. So she was not working, you know, in a college in Oxford and Cambridge with access to the Bodleian Library and to manuscripts and and above all to the language of other scholars. You know, scholarship is done in community. She wasn't doing that. She was doing this in Hampstead in her living room and going to the British Museum to look at the manuscripts. So this is a very remarkable book, and it's divided into two parts. That's very significant in itself too. In the first part, she's aware in 1911 that she has to give mysticism a bit of more respectability because it's got all this esoteric stuff floating around it. So she locates it in everyday life. And the first part is called the mystic fact. I know the word fact. Fact and mysticism were maybe not two words that people had tended to put together. And she connects it to a number of things: mysticism and psychology, mysticism and theology, mysticism and symbolism, mysticism and magic. And to take, for example, mysticism and psychology, the new science of psychology was just emerging around 1900. Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. Carl Gustav Jung, Freud's disciple initially, was beginning to work on his theory of archetypal complexes and symbolism and so on. And the most important book of all in that area was the great William James, brother of the novelist Henry James. William James wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is one of the groundbreaking books of the late 19th century, in which he discussed mysticism from a psychological point of view. So Underhill also attempts to say, what is the psychology of mysticism? In other words, what states are people experiencing in themselves when they're having mystical experience? Second thing she tried to do was connect it to theology. Because while we may take that for granted, because we now live in a world where people are always connecting things or trying to, around 1900, certainly in the Catholic Church and in the Anglo-Catholic sector of the church to which she belonged, mysticism and spirituality were on one side of a divide and theology was on the other. Disastrous divide, which should never have happened. Man separated, but God had never intended to be kept apart. Theology had become something you went to Oxford and Cambridge to study. It was the only places you could really study theology until around the late 19th century. So theology was an abstract discipline in which you learned foreign languages and you studied history and church history and doctrine. But the spiritual life and the mystical life was completely separated from that. So what she's doing is recovering the older Christian tradition, that they're not separate tracks. They're actually two parts of the same thing. And that if we talk about God, theology, theologos, we talk best about God from a position of experiencing God, which was how the Christian church had understood it for 1500 years until after the Reformation. The two things were not separated. They became separated in the modern world. So she wanted to reconnect the spiritual life and the theological life. And that's now, as I say, pretty much take it for granted wherever theology is taught. There's nothing new about that. The chapter Mysticism and Magic, I mean, when we read that in 2023, you might think, well, that's a kind of an odd thing. Magic, you know, what is it, like putting rabbits out of hats or something? Worth mentioning, the beginning to die process of Christian culture in Europe and in England, which began around the late 19th century and really peaked after World War I, left a vacuum. It left, as it does nowadays too, it left a terrible lack of a structure for one's spiritual life. people stopped going to church increasingly. I mean, the decline in church attendance dates from that period. And people had no structure. So then, as now, the vacuum was filled by all sorts of spirituality, often of a very spurious and superficial kind, Gnostic style spirituality and so on. And that was the group that she had been involved with in London, to which this Aleister Crowley, who was an old charlatan and worse, he was a member of that group. And as she moved away from that group, she began to understand that magic is about trying to control the mysterious. Mysticism, authentic mysticism, is about surrendering to God, in which you cannot control because God is a wilderness, a wild ocean, an uncontrollable thing, not a thing at all. So she wanted to rescue mysticism from its thraldom to magic and superstition and Ouija boards and all these things that were tying it down. And that explains why that chapter is in there. So the first part of this book, if you do buy this book, and really I'd recommend it thoroughly, it can be a good idea to begin with the second part. The second part has endured better than the first part because the first part is quite early 20th century. The second part, which she calls the mystic way, is much, much more useful for deepening our spiritual life. And she identifies a number of stages in what she calls the mystic way or the mystical journey. Some of them taken from the tradition, some of them her own elaboration on the tradition. The first stage she talks about is the awakening of the self. The awakening of the self. And this awakening of the self is, she gives many examples from the tradition, how people suddenly awoke as if they had been asleep or anesthetized. And the sleep is being immersed in the everyday world as though that's all there is. The great myth of our society, that that's all there is. And how we have to be awakened. A clarion call has to come to open your eyes to the light. It's the beginning of the rule of St. Benedict. Let us open our eyes to the deifying light and listen with the ear of the heart. And she wanted to unclog our senses. And she quoted all these famous people from the tradition who had been awakened to the spiritual search. There's so many of them. So the awakening of the self leads to the realization, what Paul Claudel, the French poet, said when he went into Notre Dame one night during Vespers in the early 20th century, and he was an atheist. And suddenly he felt the presence of the other, which he later learned to call God. And he said, lo, you are someone all of a sudden. Wonderful thing in Notre Dame. Behold, you are someone all of a sudden. And that realization that there is the other present immediately forces, says Underhill, a change in our way of living. It has to, because it relativizes everything else. This manifestation of the mystery of God relativizes everything. And that leads to what she calls the purification of the self. And the purification of the self, which is described by all the mystics, particularly John of the Cross, is the redirection of our energies, the recollection of our energy, which is going outward into a more inward direction, into the heart, into the soul, into the center of the self, where God sits enthroned, where God is dwelling. And note that it's not just introversion into yourself. I mean, introversion into oneself could be a disastrous thing, actually. It's turning back inward to a presence which is not oneself. It's more than oneself. Thomas Merton famously said his relationship with God was like perceiving a heartbeat, another heartbeat at the center of your own heartbeat. That sense of the presence. So when that happens, then one has to convert. In traditional Christian terms, has to change one's mind, change one's attitude, change one's behavior, adopt spiritual disciplines, the regularity of the spiritual life. And she learned that from von Hugel. It has to be grounded and rooted in the everyday and in the simplicity of prayer. Can't be highfalutin. It has to be connected to the everyday. And as that is practiced, she believed, you move through into what she calls the illumination of the self. And this is when God begins to, the sun begins to rise in the heart, and a real sense of the reality of God, of the presence of God, the practice of the presence of God begins to become more real. One begins to sense more effectively that God is there, to realize that one is being upheld by a directing hand, guided at some level. And of course, she said, this often comes with great feelings of joy, security, affirmation, relief, the realization I am not alone in this cold universe. I'm actually supported by the mystery of God. And that's very beautiful, and it leads to all kinds of rejoicing and experience, which is very positive. But she says, and here she's really echoing the deepest mystics, that can't be enough. There has to be another stage. And the other stage is what she calls the dark night of the soul, taking that expression from St. John of the Cross. You could say it like this, that God first establishes this loving, warm, enticing relationship with the self, with the soul, to draw us out of ourselves, to connect us to him because he loves us. But because we as human beings have a tendency to cut everything down to our own size and to turn God into a commodity available to us like all the other commodities that we think we can command, God needs to do a radical reconfiguration of us to get us to go deeper and to go further by withdrawing from us all that consolation and all that joy and all that rejoicing that came in the stage of illumination, and God recedes. And the soul, the self, experiences that as the loss of God, the absence of God, dryness, aridity in prayer, boredom, the feeling that God is in some way gone away, gone on holiday, not with me anymore. And she uses the imagery that John of the Cross uses, of course, the bride in the Song of Songs, where it says in the great classical love song of Jewish and Christian mysticism, where the bride has gone to bed and closed the door, secure and smug, and the door is knocked, and she opens the door, and the bridegroom is escaping into the night, into the dark. And in the Song of Songs, she goes out into the dark. And Evelyn Underhill is saying that this stage of relationship with God is when God really becomes God. Not just, as someone, Karl Barth once said, a bigger version of myself, or a spiritual commodity that's there for me to manipulate and control, I think, but instead the living God, the holy, holy, holy of Isaiah chapter 6, whose glory fills all heaven and earth. And above all, the God who came to us in the crucified Christ, to whom von Hugel had directed her at the beginning of her spiritual life, the Christ of the cross. And Christ on the cross cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Before moving through those stages of into your hands I commend my spirit. So Underhill is echoing John of the Cross and Ruysbroeck and Eckhart, and all of them, they all argue for this, that in order to get us to grow up spiritually, God, if you like, weans us off the consolations of superficial spiritual life to make us grow, to make us become greater in his sight than we have been. And in all of that, it's always God leading and drawing us on. And then the final chapter, she talks about the unit of life. And this is a really interesting thing in her book, because she picks up an idea from John Ruysbroeck, who was this 14th century Augustinian priest in Flanders, near Brussels, that when you reach that, whoever does, reaches that level of deep, intimate union with God, which is purified of self-seeking and selfishness and superficiality, and becomes a real sense of God, the presence of God in one's life, that doesn't happen so that we can then sit down and bask in it. It happens because God has a mission for people, and the mission is to communicate his love beyond our prayer experience. So she talks with Ruysbroeck about the common life and by the communal life. And by that she means that a healthy mystical life will have two sides. It'll be Janus-like, two faces. One turned always towards God, the source of light, and the other turned away from God, through which God can radiate. And she talks about the going and the coming. And in a way, it's the pattern all prayer lives have. I mean, we leave the world to pray. We leave the prayer to return to the world, coming back and the going out. The Lord will bless your going out and your coming in, it says in the Psalms, this backwards and forwards movement. But that's usually for us a chronological thing. Half an hour I'm praying, and then I go out and I do activity, and then I come back to half an hour's praying, let's say. She's saying that in the really unified Christian life, the two dimensions are one. So that even when you're in the middle of activity, the sense of the awareness, the unity with God, the presence of God endures and is always there. A perpetual sense, an awareness, consciousness of God's presence. And when we're more explicitly in prayer time, we don't leave our loved ones, our families, our friends, all the people whom we need to intercede for. We don't leave them at the door. They are also there. There's always this interpenetration of the active and the contemplative, the outside and the inside, the inner and the outer. And her great patron saint for that was John Ruysbrook. It's one of his greatest insights mystically. But the other person for whom she didn't have an awful lot of interest was Ignatius Loyola. Ignatius Loyola, who was influenced by all these people as well, he told his Jesuits in the 16th century, it was a very activist sort of century, he told them they should be contemplatives in action. Contemplatives in action. It's very different from the old monastic tradition, where you left the world and went and lived in a contemplative space called a monastery. For a Jesuit, the monastery is the world, and that's where God is to be encountered. Now, although Underhill didn't write much about Ignatius, she was more interested in the other two Spaniards, Teresa and John of the Cross. He was Catalan, actually, to be fair to him. She certainly tried to reach the same notion of a unified life lived in the presence of God, in which God is transforming the heart to be of service to others. And really, finally, to conclude before we have some questions, I think her greatest achievement was to teach people, an entire generation of people in the Anglican Church, in the other churches, and in the Roman Catholic Church where she was and is read, that mysticism is not floating up in some spiritual sphere. Mysticism is about bringing the love of God into the everyday, connecting it to the real world. I think that's her greatest achievement. And I only wish that some of these companies would republish her. And I kept telling Anglican ordinands in Cambridge when I was teaching them, would you please start reading Evelyn Underhill, start writing doctorates about Evelyn Underhill, rescue her from obscurity, because she's certainly one of the greatest women theologians of the 20th century. Okay, that leaves us about just under 15 minutes for questions or comment about anything. It can be any of the four, it doesn't have to be Evelyn Underhill, or anything that arises as a result of this. Feel free to disagree. And don't forget to unmute.
May I?
Hello, Margaret.
Yeah, hello. First of all, I found your 4 talks were absolutely fascinating. They really are. And I think this one is even more fascinating than 3 others.
Thank you.
I have the impression, but I may be completely wrong, this is a sort of a general view, that the mystics were always somewhat suspect, considered suspect by the established church.
Yeah.
Now, right or wrong, does this come from the fact because the mystics actually present a direct line to God and to understanding, thereby bypassing the hierarchy and the establishment, or what is it that makes them sort of feared by the established churches?
Well, I mean, the immediate answer to the first 2 comments is yes and yes. And the answer to the final question, I'll try to do. She discusses this herself, actually, and it's discussed in Bernard McGinn. Bernard McGinn has published this multi-volume history of mysticism. He's a whole section on heresy. It's interesting, in the Christian tradition, there isn't that suspicion of the mystical tradition until the high Middle Ages. And where it really begins with a vengeance is in the 13th century, when a French woman mystic shamefully is burned at the stake in Paris for apparently teaching, they said, that you can reach an intense union with God so close that there is no difference between us and God. Marguerite Porete. Now, Marguerite Porete, we now know, was not simply saying that. She's dialectical thinker. So as soon as she says one thing, you've got to balance it with another thing. And if you take one of the things out of context, it sounds bizarre. But why was it that aroused such fear and such suspicion? I think you put your finger exactly on it, Margaret, that it appears to be an alternative source of access to God, which bypasses or seems to bypass what you could call officially sanctioned versions of the distribution of grace. And there has been a love-hate relationship between the institutional church and the mystical traditions since the High Middle Ages in the West. Less so in the Eastern Church. In the Eastern Church, they tend to have a more holistic view of these things. And also in the Eastern Church, the monastic order, they generally aren't ordained. Most of them are laymen and women. Whereas the monastic order in the East, most of them became clergy. So in the Eastern Church, there is this awareness of a vast squadron of spiritual Christians who are not clerically ordained in the hierarchy. They're not bishops, priests, and deacons, but who are spiritual men and women, the famous startsi, plural of starlets, as in Dostoevsky's novels in the Russian tradition. So yes, it does seem to be suspicious because it's apparently an alternative route. In fact, most of the great Christian mystics were completely orthodox people who believed that you reach this intense union with God through scripture, liturgy, and prayer, and, as von Hugel taught her, service of the poor. So I don't think it's a just or accurate criticism, but just in case you think it's a Catholic or Anglican problem, it's been as big a problem in the Lutheran tradition. I mean, 17th century Lutherans produced some really wonderful mystics, all of whom were condemned by the Lutheran Church. So the mystics do keep us on our toes, and they keep the clerical church on its toes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to follow up that, perhaps your last comment there a bit, Earl, about it's kind of drawing out, what is the groundwork for mysticism?
Yeah.
And is it something which I suppose, how could you take it into a parish? I suppose.
Yeah.
Or even a cathedral, and wanting to help people actually draw into that kind of intimacy. But I suppose I resonated with what you said very much about clergy who have sort of been very trained in this very German Protestant way, which is very lots of information and critical study of scripture. It's a long way away from that kind of mystical contemplation which you've been talking about in these lectures. So yeah, I just wondered how would you approach it if you were starting afresh in a new place as a parish priest and you wanted to help people engage with this?
Well, I've been 4 years in this parish, Dan, as you know, and I'm sure you've heard that it's absolutely flourishing with mystics who are going all over the Diocese of Chichester, because I've been telling them about mysticism. That's not how it happens, It's interesting. Bernard McGinn says in his book, none of the great Christian mystics practiced a thing called mysticism. They practiced their religion. And if you read Meister Eckhart and John of the Cross and all these people, and Teresa of Avila, they practiced forms of the Christian religion within which people were able to grow up into a more intense immediacy of contact with God. But it comes through the forms of the religion. Again, it's very rooted. That's why von Hugel was directing her always to the incarnate Christ, prayer to the poor. The attempts to pursue mysticism are likely to lead to spiritual hubris and the kind of nonsense that pseudo-spiritual types and gurus like to go on with. A really serious Christian mystic will not be telling you they're practicing Christian mysticism. They'll be practicing their faith. And McGinn makes the interesting point, that's true of Islamic mysticism too, that none of them imagined they were practicing mysticism. They went to the mosque, they said their prayers, they kept the 5 pillars of Islam. And within that, God generates, if you like, a deeper level of spiritual life. So the bottom line is always, just as you cannot write great poetry without having learned grammar and using grammar, but the grammar isn't the poetry. And you cannot do great philosophy by just learning logic, but you still have to have done the logic. There's a groundwork of prayer, self-discipline, at some degree of personal asceticism and self-control, reading of scripture, liturgy and worship. And it's interesting, her last book, and one of her greatest books, is called Worship. It was commissioned by the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And in that book, she covers the whole span of Christian worship, including Quaker worship and Reformed worship and Anglican and Roman Catholic and Orthodox. And in all of them, her conclusion is that worship, liturgical worship and communal worship, is the way in which God brings us into a deeper relationship with himself. So practice the religion rather than mysticism.
I'll do my best, thank you.
Is what she'd say. David.
Yeah, I've enjoyed all 4 talks, although I've only been able to be at this one in person. A lot of what you have spoken about is spoken into the Catholic, into the Anglican, into the Lutheran tradition. Would you like to comment on the impact of mysticism and, say, someone like Evelyn Underhill on perhaps the more sort of Reformed, possibly Presbyterian tradition? Have they struggled with it, or have sections of that part of the Christian church embraced it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question again, and a very complex one, which I'll try to summarize as quickly as I can. If you read the greatest Reformed theologian of the 20th century, and there's a lot of it, Karl Barth, he was Swiss. Barth, for most of his career, was extremely negative about what he called mysticism. And that's because, as a good Reformed Christian, very, very Christocentric in his approach to things, he looked a bit askew at the kind of tradition that she had become from, which is also the thing, remember, von Hugel, as a Roman Catholic, was telling her to be careful about this free-floating, mystical thing disconnected from a real religion, or indeed from the person of Christ. And that has tended to be a 20th century Presbyterian criticism. But in the last 25 years, a lot of Reformed theologians are now saying, look, we need to get back to an earlier Christian tradition. And interestingly, they've discovered, of course, that Calvin, whom you might think was about the least mystical person who ever lived, Calvin was himself hugely influenced by Christian mysticism. One of the biggest sources of quotations in Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion is the works of St. Bernard, one of the great medieval mystics. And that's the case also for Luther. In fact, there were 3 medieval influences in Luther's version of Christianity, which were all mystical ones. And Calvin himself actually used the expression mystical union. So there's a growing openness on the basis that, the Enlightenment period, the 18th century, the rationalism and so on, again, as in the Catholic Church, divorced spirituality from theology, and that a living theology has to be a spiritually alive thing for it to be actually functioning as real knowledge of God. So there is a recuperation also in the Reformed traditions. And I mean, people say about Karl Barth, if he were alive today, it's easy to do this, certainly he would have a different view of it. And towards the end of his life, he lived a long life, you can see that he was moving in a much more positive direction, partly through his friendships with Catholics. He was a very ecumenical person. But Catholics mustn't be allowed to monopolize this, because it is in fact a Christian deepening of all forms of Christian faith. And we haven't even been able to mention, we don't have the time, anything beyond the Christian tradition. I mean, the Jewish world already had and has a great mystical tradition, which is completely separate from the Christian one, and the Islamic tradition. But actually, that's moving outside my area of competence, because I don't know those languages. So I tend to stay with things where I can actually read the sources if I can. By the way, in the chat, Susan Yarnell Monks to everyone draws attention to the prayer books of Evelyn Underhill. They were the little notebooks that she kept for the retreats that she gave. I forgot to mention, she was the first woman to give retreats to Anglican clergy. You can imagine what an intimidating thing that must have been at the first day, but she got over it very quickly. And she ran retreats in Pleshy House, and she wrote down these prayers, and they were published quite recently as the prayer book of Evelyn Underhill. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
It's 2016, I think she discovered
very
them.
recent.
But they're lovely. They're full of lovely prayers, some of which she copied from other sources, but some of which are her own.
Yes.
But thank you so much. These 4 talks have been absolutely wonderful.
I'm glad you enjoyed them. I enjoy doing them, as you may have noticed. I hope.
No.
And it's great to see
share your enjoyment.
Yeah, I think, and it's a nice place.
Coming to an end, Dan, are we?
It's a lovely place to finish.
Goodbye. I just want to say happy Easter and a blessed Pascha to everybody as we prepare for the greatest week and 3 days of the year.
Thank you, Earl. And just a reminder too, if you didn't pick up earlier on, Earl is doing this series on the diocese, for the diocese, on the Old Testament. So do have a look on the diocesan website for the year of the Old Testament, so you can enter a completely different world. Well, not a completely different world, but
and Dan's doing one of them as well, by the way.
The temple, yes, exactly. So
in fact, the Mark Lloyd, is it Mark Lloyd, Dan? Who's
no, that's a separate track. He's doing a guided reading through Genesis and Exodus, but we have 10 seminars. If you go on the training brochure,
because I couldn't,
and you'll find the dates. It's between now and November.
Well, I'll try and put up a link on the website.
Okay, good.
Please.
Find that, Charlotte. Yeah, but just one more. Thank you, absolutely fabulous, and we hope we can persuade you back to teach us again on the Cathedral Theology Network. And yes, take care, everyone. And hope to see you. We're wishing you all a very happy Easter when it comes.
Thank you
so much.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye.
Thank you.